And Delia's How to Cook Parts 1 and 2 are available on BBC Video.
The blisters were all over.
On BBC Two next, smallpox drama till it happens, and if it should, are we prepared? Newsnight asks the question at 10:30.
Am I really going to do this?
The deed is done.
Pray for me.
The trap is set.
Meet my cousin, Scourge of Petersburg's criminal pluses.
The examining magistrate, actually. It's a policeman with knobs on.
The game begins.
I'm not afraid of anyone now.
Oh, we'll make him suffer. But will he make himself?
What if I was to tell you that it was me?
Will crime bring punishment?
Had you there completely?
The original crime thriller.
What are you looking for?
A really good time.
John Sim in Crime and Punishment.
If you suspect me, then arrest me!
Next Tuesday and Wednesday at 9 on BBC Two.
On BBC Two now, based on extensive research into bioterrorism, a fictional film made to look like a documentary, set in the near future, graphically depicting the consequences of a terrorist attack using one of the most deadly viruses known to man: smallpox. The programme's makers are online now with bioterrorism expert Dr. Tara O'Neill. Join them at bbc.co.uk/smallpox2002 or stay tuned for Newsnight discussing the disease.
A body emerges from the ice. Was it misadventure or murder? How had he ended up dead in the ice?
The Iceman died in spring.
A mark on the back of the head which looked like a pressure mark.
I noticed this shadow, this foreign body.
We can see that it's a fresh wound, not an old wound.
I thought, this can't be true.
New forensic discoveries unlock a 5,000-year-old murder mystery, older than Stonehenge.
This is one of your European ancestors.
Case closed or open verdict. The Death of the Iceman. Horizon, Thursday at 9 on BBC Two.
Newsnight now on BBC Two with Jeremy Vine.
They died doing their duty, and 5 reports have now cleared them. So why won't the Ministry of Defence stop blaming the pilots for this crash? Good evening. 29 people were killed when the RAF Chinook crashed into a hillside on the Mull of Kintyre in 1994. Successive investigations have cleared the 2 pilots. Another did today, but the MOD seems wedded to the findings of the 2 RAF air marshals who decided they were negligent. We'll ask the minister, how can he be sure? And Americans may have responded well to George Bush's axis of evil speech, but it has had a slow handclap in European capitals. One of the president's big hitters is here to tell us whether he can change minds. Plus, what if it did happen here? The smallpox outbreak film on BBC Two tonight was fiction. Why won't the government's doctors give us the facts? It's now 8 years since a group of Britain's most senior intelligence officers were killed in the Chinook crash. The events have been studied by an RAF Board of Inquiry, the Public Accounts Select Committee, the Air Accident Investigation Branch, a Fatal Accident Inquiry, and today the conclusions of a House of Lords Select Committee were published too. All of the above investigations decided the pilots should not be blamed. But the Ministry of Defence is sticking with the verdict of 2 air marshals who, quite separately, said they were certain the actions of pilots Cook and Tapper brought the helicopter down, finding them guilty of gross negligence. Paul Mason reports.
The government didn't want this report. A large minority in the Lords voted against setting up the select committee that delivered it. But for the families of the 2 dead pilots convicted of gross negligence after the 1994 Mull of Kintyre disaster, it's a vindication.
It's a question of honour. As far as we're concerned, our boys have now been exonerated. What we want now is the government to catch us up.
The crash was the RAF's worst peacetime disaster. 25 Northern Ireland intelligence experts and 4 aircrew died. Accident investigators scoured the wreckage, but they found no conclusive proof of technical malfunction or pilot error. The RAF Board of Inquiry refused to find the pilots guilty of negligence, a conclusion repeated when the station commander at RAF Odium reviewed its findings. A Scottish fatal accident inquiry again refused to blame the pilots, but two of the top men in the RAF overturned the board's original findings. They said the two pilots, Rick Cook and Jonathan Tapper, had been guilty of gross negligence, a verdict the equivalent of manslaughter, and under RAF rules requiring there be no doubt whatsoever. But experts discovered there were doubts about the Chinook's new engine software, and had been since 1989.
In 1989, a software-related problem caused the Chinook to be effectively destroyed, and the MOD sued over that case and won £3 million in compensation because of the destroyed Chinook. But there have been several smaller incidents, specifically on the Chinook that crashed later on in 1994. Several instances of spurious warnings, of error messages coming up, and these were constantly logged by the pilots of the Chinook.
The fight to clear the pilots then spent years in the parliamentary committee system. A Defence Committee report didn't challenge the finding, but nor did it set out to. The Public Accounts Committee found the verdict unsustainable in the light of the evidence. And today, 5 members of the House of Lords called for the guilty verdict to be overturned. But the Ministry of Defence replied with words it's used in the face of every challenge to the verdict: no new evidence. But today's report did consider new evidence. Evidence from the last man to see the Chinook, who said his original statement had not been properly collected. Evidence from the RAF's main technical expert on the Chinook, who was pulled off the investigation by order of his senior officer. And evidence of contaminated hydraulics in a later Chinook crash. The Lords also heard, behind closed doors, from Witness A, a Special Forces pilot. He had experienced a series of problems with the Chinook's FADEC engine control system, a system that had already failed RAF tests at Boscombe Down, and an independent test by software firm EDS Sycon.
They occupied our minds to a great degree. Crew room talk was of little else at the time. The crews felt extremely uneasy about the way the aircraft had been introduced into service.
And who was responsible for operational management of the Chinook fleet? Whose job was it to minimise the disruption caused by problems with the new engine software? Air Marshals Ratton and Day, the same two officers who were to overturn the Board of Inquiry and declare the pilots guilty.
Here we have a new helicopter introduced into service, and the people involved in that decision are also involved in the judgment on the pilots. That they may have behaved perfectly honourably, indeed it's likely they did, but the simple fact of the matter is we cannot allow that circumstance to apply when people's reputations, their honour, everything that people think of them in the future is at stake.
Air Chief Marshal Ratton is retired, but Air Chief Marshal Sir John Day is currently head of Strike Command. Today's report criticises him for repeatedly treating his own hypotheses and assumptions as facts.
If the MOD accepts that it wasn't pilot error that caused this crash, then the finger of blame points to technical failure, and that opens a can of worms. Specifically, why did they allow 25 of the most senior intelligence officers in Northern Ireland to get on a helicopter that the MOD's own experts refused to certify as airworthy, that had hundreds of bugs in the software, and that the pilots themselves didn't want to fly on the morning of the crash?
If somebody did rush the Chinook Mark II into service with software and mechanical problems, then the buck stops here at the Ministry of Defence. But MOD officials seem to have misbriefed ministers all down the line. They said Boscombe Down's testing methods were wrong. They said the EDS Sycon report into the software was irrelevant. They claimed FADEC was not a safety-critical system, and said the lawsuit against FADEC's manufacturers was not about software faults. Every assertion either withdrawn or subsequently disproved by independent parliamentary evidence. The MOD could choose to ignore today's report, but one former Labour Defence Secretary thinks that would have constitutional implications.
They cast doubt on the whole of the relationship between the executive and the legislature, between Parliament and the executive. And of course, one of the great things that everybody is now worried about is whether Parliament can keep enough control over the executive. And if the Ministry of Defence are allowed to get away with this, the conclusion will be that they don't really take much notice of Parliament.
Ministers' responses today suggest that's exactly what might happen. As the standoff develops over today's report findings, the families of the 2 dead pilots could be as far away as ever from closure.
Paul Mason reporting. Earlier, I asked the Armed Forces Minister Adam Ingram whether he was going to have to look at all this again after the House of Lords report.
Well, I think we're going to have to look at this report in some detail. It's a very thorough report, carried out with a lot of rigour in terms of the examination of the evidence and the facts in front of them. And we will obviously give that detailed due consideration. But I've got to say that our early examination of this doesn't show there's any new evidence or new facts. It's just simply a case of a different judgment taken by this committee as opposed to the earlier judgment. But there is new evidence, isn't it? Because for a start, the problems with the fly-by-wire computer system that was used in the Chinook was not considered by the Air Marshals, but has been considered by this House of Lords inquiry. All the new evidence that came forward was considered subsequent to the earlier decision and was dismissed on the basis it wasn't material to the other part of the Air Marshal's judgment, and that was on the pilots' judgments and the way in which they were carrying out their actions. And I've got to say the current report doesn't give much weight to that aspect to it, about the airmanship aspect of the flight. Yeah, but that's effectively what they considered about the FADEC system, this fly-by-wire computer system, is new evidence that the Air Marshals did not include in their report. There was a knowledge of that subsequent in probably more detail, all of which was then taken into account in further reviews of this judgment. We've said consistently, and previous governments have said the same, if any new evidence had come forward which would have cast serious doubt on the earlier judgment, then of course a change of approach would have been adopted. Well, in that case, what about the Chinook, the US Chinook that flipped over at 1,000 feet, fell 750 feet Jeremy,
before turning back again? That was in '97. That wasn't considered.
Jeremy, I'm not going to get into all the details of the technical aspects of this at this point.
But it's important.
Well, it may be important to you at this point. What I'm saying to you is that I've got to consider the best technical advice that I will be given on the back of what the Lord's inquiry has said. Now, we've got to give consideration to this, and if there is a case of new evidence or new facts that we have to examine, then we've got to do that. But I'm not going to do that a few hours after the publication of the report. No, that's fine, but my point, Mr. Ingram, is that you've been saying all day there's no new evidence, and you've now conceded there might be. Well, no, I've not conceded anything. Use the word if. What I've said is, on the face of it, in the first examination, there is no new evidence on new facts, and I will then receive a detailed report from my officials, both on the technical side and the other aspects of the argumentation in the Lord's inquiry report, and then we'll give further consideration to this. That seems to be the best way of approaching this, rather than rushing to judgment. There has been a whole host of inquiries now: fatal accident inquiry, an air accident investigation inquiry, the RAF Board of Inquiry, which was separate from the Air Marshal's conclusions, then the Public Accounts Committee inquiry, then the House of Lords Select Committee inquiry, which you're hearing about today. Essentially, 5 inquiries have decided they cannot come to a conclusion. Why is it that the MOD has gone with the one inquiry which has come to the conclusion? And of course, this was not a decision which I would have made. This goes back a good number of years in a previous administration. They reached that conclusion based upon the very high-quality judgment which was made by 2 very senior Air Force officers, one of whom was a very experienced helicopter pilot. But there were 5 other inquiries that found it inconclusive. The number of inquiries doesn't, it's not a case of 5-1, or someone said to me earlier today it was 3-1. It's not the numbers of inquiries that's important, it's the quality of the assessment based upon the facts and the evidence that we have to arrive at. These are very weighty matters. There are 29 lives for loss in this, not just the 2 pilots' lives. And we've got to give consideration to all of that as well. But you have on this committee a law lord, an ex-chairman of the bar, a couple of QCs, a member of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and you talk about a higher quality of judgment coming from these 2 Air Marshals. I talked about the high quality of judgment of these 2 Air Marshals. Right. Two very experienced pilots. One of them a very experienced helicopter pilot. But not necessarily a higher quality of judgment, then? A quality of judgment which we believe has stood the test of time and subsequent examinations by previous administrations and by previous ministers who have looked at this. There are people who will be saying that what the MOD is trying to do here is simply to avoid these 2 Air Marshals ending up looking like idiots. Well, that's a rubbish allegation. These are very senior officers. We certainly have a great amount of confidence in their judgment. There's no question at all about that. But we have to distill the quality of the advice and the judgment they make as ministers to justify this to the wider public. That's what previous ministers have done. They've stood by that particular decision of those air marshals because the quality, the whole status of the report was so high.
Minister, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The US Secretary of State Colin Powell today followed up President Bush's description of Iran, Iraq and North Korea as an axis of evil. Mr. Powell said they were deserving of that kind of designation, but he added it does not mean we are ready to invade anyone or not willing to engage in dialogue. Quite the contrary. The debate gives us an insight into the tilt of US foreign policy. Far from newly dedicating itself to forging international alliances, is it actually becoming unilateralist? In a moment, we'll hear from the Undersecretary at the State Department. But first, our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, reports.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Barely a week has passed since President Bush's State of the Union address, and today's Secretary of State Colin Powell went back up the hill to clarify what the President had in mind.
Because we are willing to engage in dialogue, and we are quite willing to work with friends and allies around the world to deal with these kinds of regimes, there's no reason for us not to identify them for what they are. Regimes that are inherently evil. Their people are not evil, but the governments that lead them are evil. And the clearer we make this statement and the more sure we are of our judgments, the better able we will be to lead the international coalition.
And as Europe's darling in the Bush administration teased out the connections between Iran, Iraq and North Korea, Washington's critics in Europe drew wider lessons from the axis of evil remark.
I think this is the development of a policy of unilateralism which cannot be accepted. I think it cannot be done that the United States find out some targets and the rest of the world has to follow. We have to come together and discuss our joint interests and then make a decision. The alliance cannot work when the Americans just try to make us follow.
In many ways, unilateralism suits George Bush just fine, though. The president is boosting defense spending, buttressing America's military advantage, while his poll ratings soar on the promise that the Taliban will just be the first enemy to feel the force.
The terrorists hit us before September 11th on many occasions. The World Trade Tower was bombed before that. We did not respond forcefully. We had our soldiers dragged through the streets of Somalia. We did not respond forcefully. We've had planes blown out of the sky. We have not responded forcefully. Going back to the time of the bombing of our embassy in Beirut and the killing of our Marines there under Reagan in 1983, in none of these instances have we responded forcefully. September 11th was a wake-up call.
If Washington is increasingly assertive in defense of its security, this arises in part from the fact that America and its symbols overseas are today under greater threat. Today, at the American Embassy in London, for example, dozens of firemen and police responded to initial reports suggesting a gas attack, which turned out to be a gas leak.
After September the 11th, many analysts predicted that America might become more engaged with the wider world. But that hasn't really happened. Seeing themselves as the principal targets of global terrorism and what President Bush now calls the axis of evil, Washington seems to have resolved to take more and more of the key diplomatic and military decisions by itself. And many European decision makers candidly admit, looking at the success of the American campaign in Afghanistan, that they can understand why there's a certain amount of triumphalism now on the other side of the Atlantic.
Frequent visits.
For the British government, President Bush's inclusion of Iran in the axis of evil has been particularly awkward. Britain has been putting great efforts into improving relations with Tehran, as has Germany and other European nations.
The Americans are dead set becoming more assertive vis-a-vis Iran, and I see the Europeans continuing their policy of engagement because they believe that's the best way forward. So I expect the Europeans to continue with their plans to start, for instance, negotiations on a trade agreement with Iran. I expect the British to proceed with their policy of critical dialogue.
America's tougher stance against Iran stems from Tehran's recent complicity in an arms shipment to the Palestinians, evidence of weapons programs, and intelligence that some al-Qaeda leaders may be being harbored in Iran, charges Iran's foreign minister responded to today. He challenged the Americans to produce their evidence or stop making the claims. And in mediating relations between Iran and America, Europeans now use similar language to describe those in Tehran and Washington upon whom they now pin their hopes.
There is a division within the U.S. administration, there's a division across Washington, there's a spectrum of opinion. And that is good news, because we can then support the moderates like Colin Powell, who still have a degree of influence over the shape of U.S. policy.
In the 90s, it was the stresses and strains of the Balkans that opened cracks in the Western alliance. Now, increasingly, it's in the Middle East that the sharpest differences of opinion are occurring between Washington and its principal allies.
This is different, again, because Americans were killed, not only Americans, but specifically Americans, by the thousands, by groups of people who have sworn to do it again and again and again. I think there are many things on which we want to compromise and with our friends, and I think we want to consult with our friends, but the issue of whether or not we're going to protect Americans from being slaughtered, I don't think is a useful one to ask our allies or anyone else, do you think it's a good idea to protect our citizens?
A muscular foreign policy has worked well so far for Bush, but there are still relationships he must cultivate to make it work, and that means the allies have not altogether lost their leverage.
Mark Urban, let's speak now to the US Under-Secretary of State John Bolton. Are you surprised the extent to which this axis of evil speech has been like a bucket of cold water in Europe?
Well, I'm not entirely surprised, but I do think it's important to make sure that we have explained fully what we know about the capabilities of these three states, and particularly Iran, which has seemingly aroused the most difficulty. This is a state that is aggressively pursuing nuclear weapons. It has an active biological weapons program, an active chemical weapons program, and a ballistic missile program that can already reach Turkey and Israel.
But the fact that, for example, the Spanish Prime Minister was meeting Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister in Madrid today, does that then worry you?
Well, what worries me is the belief that the institutions of the Iranian government, like the foreign ministry, really have any say in the national security policy in Iran. It would be ideal from everybody's point of view if there really were a democratically elected government in Iran that had power, but it does not. The power is controlled by the clerics. They control the national security services. They are the people who are developing weapons of mass destruction.
But the language, the axis of evil language, is it not the language of disengagement? And the Spanish approach today, which we've seen with them trying to put together a trade accord, is the engagement alternative. You agree with that?
I do not agree with that. I think if you define engagement as going to the government of Iran and saying, please give up your weapons of mass destruction, that is not a strategy we think is effective. Although I will say the government of Iran holds the key to its dilemma in its own hands. If it forswears weapons of mass destruction, if it abjures support for international terrorism, our policy will change. Our policy I would characterize as engagement by aggressively seeking to persuade those who are proliferating to Iran to cease their proliferation, and to get our European allies to join with us in cutting off the demand side in Iran as well.
But if you describe a country as evil, you effectively disengage, do you not?
I don't think so, and I think Secretary Powell made it clear that the President was talking about the government of Iran, and this is really the key question. Acknowledging that Iran is complex, that there are many pro-Western people among the citizenry as a whole, do you strengthen the hand of the moderates by making concessions to the extremists? We think not.
But you surely don't strengthen the hand of the moderates by describing the country as evil and allowing the extremists to then plead their case with their own people.
I think those who seek to acquire biological weapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear weapons to threaten their neighbors in violation of their own solemn treaty commitments that sponsor terrorist acts in the region and around the world can only be described that way.
So what do you think when Javier Solana, for example, the EU's foreign policy chief, praises Iran for helping to rebuild Afghanistan and saying, in my language, it's a statement, and this is George Bush's terms, which will not carry any meaning, but I understand that in the American language it may?
Well, I'm not sure in the English language what that means exactly, but I will say this. The actions of the Iranian government in the immediate aftermath of September 11 and the actions they took with respect to Afghanistan were helpful to our international coalition's efforts, but they were actions that Iran took in its own national interest. I'm not complaining about that. I'm glad that they did it. But nobody should have any illusions they were operating above and beyond the call of duty to help out the international coalition.
Why not name Syria on your list as well, then?
Well, there are a lot of states that could be competitors to be on the list of axis of evil. I think what the President has done is highlight the three most dangerous. And as he said, these are the world's most dangerous nation armed with the world's most destructive weapons. And that's a problem for the United States and its friends and its allies.
So where does axis of evil lead you now, then, in terms of practical action?
I think what the President has done is change the terms of debate. By highlighting these three countries, he has identified priorities for the United States and hopefully priorities for our friends and allies. We have been in consultation with governments that are proliferating to Iran, for example. We have urged them to cease their activity. We're going to continue to do that. I've been here in London this week consulting with the government on practical steps to take against the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. This is all part of the effort that we have to undertake.
But what do you actually do to Iran?
Well, I think the isolation of the government of Iran, that is to say, those people pursuing weapons of mass destruction, raising the cost to them of getting these weapons, and generally impeding their efforts to do so is important as a lesson to them, as a lesson to the people of Iran of the kind of change they need to make in their government, and as a lesson to other would-be proliferators as well.
On your list and the countries in your list, would Israel not fit this category, given that it has weapons of mass destruction and a policy of killing its enemies outside its own borders?
Israel responds in self-defense when it's attacked. It does not conduct terrorist activities itself, and it's not a threat to its neighbors. That is very different from Iran, Iraq, or North Korea. Very different.
Our film talked again about the increasingly unilateralist slant to U.S. foreign policy, and effectively nothing that's been said in Europe on your trip here is going to change any of President Bush's views, is it?
Well, I always enjoy these discussions about whether the United States is unilateralist or not. I'd give you a different synonym for that. I'd call it American leadership in defining a problem and seeking to solve it. I think a lot of the commentary in Europe, unfortunately, doesn't benefit from the information and intelligence we have about the capabilities of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. It is something for us to deal with. It's an obstacle to our diplomacy, and we will deal with it.
Mr. Bolton, thank you very much indeed. We'll speak to you again in a moment, if we may, about the next subject that we're about to discuss, because President Bush released his new budget today and promptly flew to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center to highlight the most eye-catching figure on the bottom line. He wants to spend nearly $6 billion in the coming year to prepare for bioterrorist attacks. Before Newsnight, you may have been watching the BBC Two film on what might happen if smallpox broke out in New York. If the US is taking steps, how prepared are we here? Newsnight has learned that if a smallpox epidemic did begin, different countries would be expected to pool their vaccine stocks. Does that mean there isn't enough to go round? Our science editor, Susan Watts, reports.
It's a terrifying disease that humankind thought it had conquered. But to a world awake now to the reality of the fanatic with disaster their goal, comes a new possibility that smallpox, that most feared of viruses, could come back.
This is bringing people into a place for their own good. This is where the vaccine was. This was their best chance of escaping the ravages of this disease, both for themselves and their families.
Tonight's film makes its point with a mix of drama, genuine interviews with experts, and fictional video diary. The drama documentary depicts a global pandemic that begins in spring 2002 with a terrorist planting the virus in New York. Within hours, the virus is carried to London by plane. Within weeks, 30 countries face epidemics. The final toll worldwide is 60 million. So, is it credible?
What you were saying about the UK being attacked by smallpox, that cannot happen. It's only in theory. We must not really make people worried and lose sleep about things like that. But the bottom line is that we have no problem with smallpox. There is no smallpox. It has been eradicated, and it will not be back.
This is the public face of the UK medical establishment. But behind the scenes, there are serious concerns about smallpox. Because of all potential biological weapons, it's the only one that spreads so alarmingly fast. Although experts have told us the drama makers have overdone just how infectious smallpox can be, the scenario has been signed off as feasible by specialists around the world. The threat is real because although officially smallpox is stored only in 2 laboratories, one in the US and one in Siberia, defecting Russian scientists and those who stayed behind have suggested that security at the former Soviet site was not always watertight. This man was the last person on the planet to diagnose smallpox, and the memory is engraved on his heart.
I was horrified, absolutely horrified. I think never in my whole fairly long medical career could I say that my heart almost stopped, because having seen this in Bangladesh, hundreds of patients and quite a number dying or even dead, I thought I'll never see this again. And yet there I was, confronted with the problem.
A laboratory accident in Birmingham in 1978 was the last time the world faced disaster with smallpox. A medical photographer picked up the virus and fell ill over a bank holiday weekend. 3 GPs failed to diagnose smallpox during the days when she was at her most infectious. Spotting the infection early would be key to containing any outbreak today.
It's crucial, because the earlier you make the diagnosis, the earlier the patient can be isolated, and the earlier the contacts can be vaccinated. So it is absolutely crucial.
And how confident are you that people would recognise it today?
I'm not confident at all. I am confident, however, that should it be recognised, that we have enough expertise in this country to deal with the problem.
When this lab accident happened, the victim was sent to an isolation unit still operational nearby. Today, there are only 2 such units in the UK, which could cope with a handful of patients. Vaccination stopped in this country in the 60s, and since the vaccine is thought to last for a maximum of 10 years, most of us will not be immune. So how fast would smallpox spread in the UK? We're not allowed to see the official models, but late last year, British scientists examined how smallpox spread in past epidemics. They weren't allowed to talk to us directly, but by email they confirmed that from their data, one can deduce the possible spread in today's unvaccinated UK population. We did the sums and found that if we make the optimistic assumption that 1 in 5 of us remains immune today, for every case, 8 others would probably be infected. This evening, the Department of Health told us it thinks the transmission rate would be lower than that if it was spotted quickly, but could be as high as 10 to 12 if diagnosis was slow. At the end of last year, during post-September the 11th anxiety over biological attack, the World Health Organization asked member countries how much vaccine they have. The latest figure is a global stock of up to 90 million doses. It's also becoming clear that the plan is to share vaccine stocks, getting them to wherever they're needed in the world to stamp on infection before it has a chance to go anywhere.
Nobody really knows what an adequate supply is. If there's an outbreak of smallpox, it may be one person who transmits it to several others, or it may be a very large outbreak with many people infected at the same source at the same time. So what we're trying to do is to help countries do the modeling exercises necessary in order that they can understand what might be needed as far as vaccine.
So how much vaccine does the UK have? We're not allowed to know how large a stockpile we have or where it is. But in 1994, the government told the World Health Organization we have 146,000 vials. If we assume each can produce 25 doses, that means about 3.5 million doses in total. American scientists have worked out these could probably be diluted about 5 times and still be effective, which implies that we might have about 17 or 18 million doses. So what's the truth behind Britain's determination to keep hidden its true level of preparedness? It could be because bioterrorism straddles 2 government disciplines. the military, where a culture of secrecy is still the norm, and public health, where the modern message is that the more information people have, the better? Or is it because, as the government's silence suggests, we're more vulnerable than we'd want anyone to know? It looks increasingly like Britain hopes to piggyback on vaccine build-up elsewhere, particularly in the US, where only yesterday, in a surprise move, Russia offered to sell some of the 50 million doses of vaccine it will make this year. Just how the world might share its vaccines will be thrashed out next month in London. In the meantime, we have to hope that any virus in the hands of terrorists hasn't been altered to render the vaccine ineffective anyway.
Susan Watts. Earlier I spoke to the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Pat Troop, who is one of the government team in charge.